So I'm going to talk about work I've been doing over the past 10 years, more or less. And I will speak specifically around relational and sociomaterial approaches to power. And this is in relationship to the field of sustainability transitions, which is a broad and interdisciplinary field where many scholars come from various disciplines. And therefore, this brings a lot of different theoretical bases into the field, which is fantastic. But also the field as such is working around topics of rapid social change, basically how we can change our society in a quite profound way in order to have a less destructive outcome of our way of organizing ourselves and our economy. So this, of course, major changes in society always involve political struggles between different interests. So, of course, the topic of power politics is very central to scholars engaged in studying these processes of transformative change in society. So what I will do today, what I aim to do, is to explain why classical philosophy of power is not enough to understand the politics of sustainability transitions, and to provide an introduction to how action theoretical and constitutive conceptions of power, how they differ and where they meet, and the kind of richness that is available to us and that provides a basis for then shaping your own analysis and working with the concept of power in a fruitful way. I will give a case example of how I have then used these analytical tools to study processes of change and the political struggle in rural electrification projects in East Africa. And having then exemplified this, I hope I've also then opened up to a discussion around how technologies transform power and the role of technologies in then our analysis. So that's the overall goal of the lecture. So I come from, I have a background in environmental sciences combined with social science perspectives. So I have a background looking at how, for example, struggles around natural resources shape different outcomes for people in various parts of the world. And I've been working in the East African context for more than 15 years. So in this context, I've then come to work on renewable energy projects. And I was very interested in what happens after people get electricity, rather than just looking at the preconditions for electrifying rural communities. And it was a lot because I found that many rural electrification projects failed to be sustainable and produce the anticipated positive benefits. They did not necessarily diminish the levels of poverty in the communities where these microgrids or mini-grids were built. But it was also very strong supply side focus in the field and not that much attention to the interplay between local contexts and these new infrastructures that were constructed. And not much interest or work done around the governance of these systems and that interplay with the users of electricity. There's been in the field of sustainability transitions calls for at least 10 years to take more seriously the politics and the power of sustainability transitions in various sectors. And scholars have highlighted that the field has been very empirical, but also not, and kind of taking for granted that we understand power and politics rather than explicitly theorizing it and really working to understand its particular role in the various processes that we're studying. And so recently there's been more work done that has an explicit theoretical interest in and tries to actually figure out the role of power and politics in these processes. And it's clear that this is very important in order to understand sources of change as well as inertia in these changes, these processes of change in how humans relate to nature and how we relate to one another. When we talk about transitions in this context, it's really about transitioning from a dominant way of doing things in, for example, a sector or multiple sectors or a certain social subsystem that can be cross-scale and across countries. But transitioning from this dominant way, the established way of doing things, the norms, the institutions, the infrastructures, the modes of supply and service delivery to a less destructive or more sustainable model. And this then means changes to the composition of these so-called systems in various components, but also the kind of architecture of the system, its organization. So because technologies tend to be very important and central to studies in this field, most of them look at socio-technical systems, often like transport or water or energy, but increasingly people are also looking at agriculture, fisheries, fields where the kind of base in ecosystems is much more prominent, perhaps. Then the rollout technologies has been important, but partly overlooked in kind of its role, not in as such. So people have taken a lot of interest in the role of infrastructures and technologies, but the elaboration of power and politics has not used to the full extent theorizations that do take power and politics and technology as central. So recently, for example, some colleagues in the field have sought to bridge the gap between sociomaterial approaches and complex adaptive system approaches, and kind of to elaborate and strengthen the attention to the material in how scholars in the field understand power. What I have done is to have like a starting point when I look at energy transitions, a question of how do relations of power shape these transitions, but also how do these relationships get reshaped in that process, because they always do. So when you have a significant change with, for example, a new socio-technical system that is being constructed and developed in a context, then it creates a destabilization of the social hierarchies and the relations around this supply of a new service. So the image is from a village in Tanzania where I've been working and studying a microgrid and how that has affected life in the village. So really, power, which is interesting for me because I work with it in the dual sense, both as electric power and as social power. I really needed to understand what it meant and what it did in my case. And so I came in with this broad question of how do relationships of power shape this transition that I'm studying and gets reshaped in it. But I could only make sense of the more theoretical basis later on in my work once I had the empirics. So what I've been doing is really to work from what I see on the ground and take that back into this enormous field of study to identify the ways of understanding power that could help me explain. And so I then found that there were so many ways of thinking about power it's easy to get overwhelmed. But among those, there were some scholars who really helped me clarify and put my finger on what was it that I was seeing. And so I've come to work in a quite sort of in a constructive approach to power, where I'm interested to see how different ways of understanding power provide different keys to a bigger whole. So I've been very interested also in the contradictions and the tensions between different ways of seeing. And in every day, we talk about power as if we know what it is, right? We talk about the powerful, the power elites, the empowerment of certain groups, or the powerlessness of others. So power clearly occupies a central place, but it has this analytical difficulty. So in many instances, people choose to rather work with concepts like institutions or governance or authority because they are more precise. So among the reasons why it's hard to grasp different concepts of power is because people tend to talk about it without saying, like, now I'm speaking around this aspect of power. So, I mean, there's the question of what is power, but also how does it work? How does it manifest? What are the outcomes? What are the intentions? And then people create these typologies with different names and labels. And they tend to refer to different aspects or dimensions of power. And that's not always clear. And therefore, it gets quite confusing. So we do find all these definitions out there. And sometimes they're quite contradictory. So some people say that power is the social relation built on an asymmetrical distribution of resources and risk. Some people think of it as a personal attribute. Other scholars see it as the ability of an individual to impose his or her will, or it's the power to shape environments for human action and interaction, or it's a constitutive dimension of social life. So these are just some examples taken from the bigger literature of political ecology, where power has been a very central concept, perhaps more so than in the field of sustainability transitions. But equally, when you look at sustainability transitions and what scholars write there, you also find these various formulations and definitions. And some of them do not work necessarily so well together. So one of these scholars who've been a big resource for me is Mitchell Dean. And one of the things he does is that he looks at, in the European tradition, which is also where I'm geographically based, he looks at the etymology of the word power in philosophy and languages. And he puts his finger on the duality of the word. So, for example, he mentions the words kraft, macht, puissance, pouvoir, potere. Words that work both as nouns and as verbs. So when they are nouns, it tends to refer to the force of something. And as verbs, they rather relate to the capacity to do things, action. So using his great work to kind of orient myself, I started, along with, of course, a long list of other scholars who have done this work, like Stephen Lukes and many others who have really gone through and tried to sort out different understandings of power and how they are different, how they are similar. We can kind of get to a little bit of a map or an overview where what power is then is around the capacity to act, perhaps. But then there are different types of power in terms of the form. And so power to and power over are different forms of power. Power to, we can think about as a more fundamental one, which is the power to act. And then the intention or the outcome of that may be to enact, to execute your power over someone else. That is power as dominance. But the power to act could also be done collectively, together, as a power with one another. It can also be seen as a power from within oneself, and the sort of our power to act as something that can change over one's lifetime. We can also think about it as becoming empowered over time. That is, our power to act enhances and grows over time, often because of the collective situation, the relationship to others. And the power to conceptions then can be either repressive, they can be conflictual, and they can be also what they call radical. And I'm not going to go very deep in these different understandings, but I'd be happy to also discuss and answer questions around this. This is, though, different to the sort of older understanding of power, which has much more to do with power as right and legitimate power, the power of government or the king or the ruler, which later on becomes the rule of law, the right of the state to execute power over its subject. So we do have these older sort of forms of power linked to the sovereign power, exercised by the state or its government in various shapes. And it's kind of the right to make laws, the capacity to enforce them. Later on in liberal thought, and the rule of law and legitimacy of the state. So here we find these different examples. The power to comes in so many versions. We have these different episodic conceptions, such as A has power over B, or A has power over B in a non-trivial way to affect B in a non-trivial way. And so these are only the power to conception. Now, Foucault is interesting and has profoundly changed how we think about power. Because Foucault, you could say he reacted to the older way of understanding power, linked to the power as right and the power of the ruler, the sovereign, because he saw that that was very much linked to a subject to subject kind of relation. The idea of the ruler's right to sort of the blood and the body of his subject was typically a man. And so he felt that the modern society, or the emerging, the society that he was living in, he saw a different type of power emerging, which he thought of as an economy of power, which had to do with the practices and the disciplinary techniques that changed this relationship and made it much more distanced and less personal, where where the word economy to him sort of signified the ordering and the management of bodies. This power was more strategic, it was more fluid, it was, as the way he saw it, dispositional and economic, and it kind of went back to Machiavelli rather than this sort of personal ruler to subject relation. So in this new economy of power, he could see examples like the institutions that were disciplining the bodies, but also the discourses in society that discipline people. So it wasn't that he said the old understanding of power is irrelevant, but rather he saw the need for a concrete analysis of how these relations of subjugation manufacture the subjects, that is the people who are subordinate. And the different expressions of this, specificities, and what could you do about it? Where would this power no longer be absolute, but where could it be contested? And with that, he was very interested in the local and what he saw as capillary sites of power, where there's a possibility of contestation and perhaps even a reversibility of power relations. That's where he saw the potential rather than being at the center. So what Dean does then is that he sort of identifies, working with a lot of thinkers and philosophers, and Foucault particularly, he then identifies a sort of what he sees as the signature of power. And he says that the concept of power is marked by a kind of permanent movement or a reversibility between two poles. And these poles change as a consequence of the movement back and forth. So the concept of power is only possible as a result of a series of binary distinctions. You can't like forget about one pole in order to focus on the other. You need both, and they do change through one another. So he say, let's mobilize the poles rather than discard one of them. And I agree with this. I think this shifting between these different poles is analytically extremely fruitful. And that brings me to then a different scholar who also helped me understand and make sense of this big literature and philosophy of power. And that's Amy Allen, a feminist thinker who has done this overview of feminist thought around power and politics. And it's been very important, the contribution coming from feminist thought, especially because it has highlighted power other than dominance. So the power to dominate is often thought of as a zero-sum game. And while feminist thought has been very interested in doing something around patriarchy and male dominance in society, there's also been a focus on how do you empower women? How do you empower other groups in society who are subordinate in this patriarchal system? And that has led to an interest in a power from within and a power with, so a collective power. And thanks to that, we're getting more balance between dominance and empowerment. And so then power too changes from a zero-sum game to a spectrum and something that can actually be enlarged or grow over time. And this is, for example, where Hannah Arendt was making a contribution, saying that she basically said that dominance and violence, we shouldn't think about that as power. Really, it's power with the collective power, the empowerment, that is the real power. And so she really wanted to shift the focus away from dominance only to the collective power of the people, for them to be able to see the capacity for change. And for scholars interested in social change, is this capacity to enact change that is really important. And that means that collective power becomes very important. What Amy Allen does is she identifies three large conceptions of power that are sort of at the quite fundamentally distinct. The action theoretical conception is what I've been talking about mostly now, is the power to, that it's in terms of our capacity to act. So it's often linked to human agency, but it could also be then saying that animals have agency and power. Machines have agency and power, and we may still focus on the capacity to act. So it's all about action. Different from this is then a more constitutive conception, which is more what Foucault was doing with his economy of power, where power is elusive, it's more of a force field, it's fluid, and it emerges in complex webs of relations. And here, science and technology studies and actor network theory has been very important in contributing to insisting that power is emerging in these networks rather than saying it's about specific actions and specific actors. The systemic conception is what Allen uses to refer to these sort of grand historical explanations around structures and norms and institutions that emerge over time in specific historical contexts. So that's sort of the long-term grand macro ways of discussing power. So the action theoretic conception then, it's about the capacity. And maybe the most fundamental definition is around having power is being able to make or receive any change or to resist it. It kind of captures the whole spectrum of capacity to act or enact change. But there's one contradiction that's important here, and that is the difference between understanding power as relational, as sort of emerging in our relations to one another, or understanding power as a resource, something you can like hold, something you can own, or a thing like understanding of power. And they are quite different, I would argue, because seeing power as a resource can then distinguish that power from the individuals or the actors or the collectives that have it. It is something that then can move around in society, be redistributed, but it's then kind of separate from a contextual situated encounter. So to me, these do not work very well together. And also the resource understanding can become static. And if it's static, it will not capture a lot of situations where I find a power is emerging in a very dynamic interplay. And the resource understanding is prominent in many fields, and it has been dominant in the sustainability transitions field. And it's still there and often used. And it's empirically quite powerful because then you feel like you can quantify and maybe identify situations. But I'm less interested in that personally and more interested in these encounters. And this is why the relational aspect is more important to me. This image is the panopticon, which is then relating to these institutions and disciplines and the systems the economies created. And it goes back to then Foucault's conception of constitutive power. What is important here is we shift away from human agency. It's no longer central to the understanding of power. It's sidelined, and it's rather the forces and the pressures that emerge from a multitude of interactions that is in focus. So power here constitutes the social relations, but also our relations to non-humans, both living and non-living non-humans. And so here we can see that constitutive power can emerge either from non-human actors in webs, or even more aggregate at the level of networks or assemblages, but it can also be discourses that travel around and we don't really know, and no one is really saying it, but everyone is feeling it, which I think a lot of people realize there are these psychological pressures and we can't really say who is imposing this, but still we suffer from it. And so here, of course, science technology studies has really develop these understandings. So there's such a richness also in this line of work. But also today, this has become the attention to sociomaterial understandings of power, and this is now developing a lot. So there's a lot of things happening in continuing this discussion. Where I've landed then myself is to think of power as always relational and situated in specific encounters and contexts, but also as an embodied practice. And that embodiment can be not only in people, but it can become embodied into environments and into technological designs. Personally then, I think that the relational understanding is more fruitful analytically than seeing power as a resource. And I don't think we should conflate them because I think they are ontologically quite different. However, A relational understanding of action to capacity to act works very well with the constitutive understanding of power. And this is where I've been working at the tension between these as two poles, as Dean would say, where they meet and they are in tension, and that is very productive because that allows me to account for the range of things that I see empirically when I look at energy transitions. And it allows me also to keep the politics alive because I don't need to say humans only have agency, that's all we should care about, but rather I can see the importance of intentional action, the importance of certain decisions, and the actions by individuals and groups and collectives at the same time as I can pay attention to the force fields or the elusive pressures that also emerges from these more complex webs. So technology then, where does it come in? Well, it comes in very significantly here because technology is also having this duality between a force and the capacity. So it is a natural phenomenon. It is a force in nature, but it's also enhancing and transforming human capacity to act. So I've looked more closely at how technology then becomes the intermediary between that sits at the center of those relationships that we establish between ourselves. Like now I'm giving you a talk through, thanks to technology, I can reach out over space and time to have this conversation. But it also then transforms our capacity to act in a very fundamental way. So, and this is different from an instrumentalist understanding of technology that sees it as a tool, neutral or not, but a tool only that can be quite static, where you would sort of place all the importance on the human agency side and just not pay that much attention to the technology as such. But what we need to understand is that the technological designs and even the artifacts, they embody the human values and the intentions of designers, but these are always contested as well. So there's no top-down or linear or one-way exercise of power. There's always something happening and emerging in this setup and in the relation. There's a resistance, there's a stubbornness. Both users and technologies misbehave and do not do what their designers intended. So what technologies and technological setups do in the encounters with humans and nature is that they exert pressures that are beyond human intention and control. So we then have to let go of the idea of control, and it brings more complexity and uncertainty. However, it really matters the kind of power relationships that inform technological designs, because they do tend to become embedded into those designs. So if we do change, let's say if we have other types of power relationships and more power width, perhaps more equal social relations, then those tend to innovate other types of technologies. And this is an insight by Andrew Feenberg, who has written extensively about technological power. And that's very important work for those with an interest in technologies and power. So what this means then is that if we want to understand power in webs of humans, technologies, and natural components or actants, then we need this relational view. And if we focus on those, what emerges in those relationships and how those relationships are organized, then we can see that there's always this interplay between human agency and intentional action and these pressures that come from other parts of the other participants in that web or in that system, if you want to call it a system. And this tension is always there, and it produces ambivalent outcomes. So this encounter, let's say, between an energy system and the local context, there we can see that there is a production of destabilization. Power is destabilized, social hierarchies are destabilized, but they are also reproduced at the same time. So this is always ongoing. We can't like just get rid of those social hierarchies, but we can disturb them through new technologies and the way we use them. So I've been very interested in moments or locations where effects are produced, and those effects are the ambivalent ones. And so it means empowerment and dominance are intertwined, can't separate them, but they are also very productive in that they, but it's contradictory what comes out of it. So what we're getting then from this view is that both discursive, abstract, socially abstract, and material effects in turn enable and constrain actors in this continuous process of becoming. So it's never ending, it's always going on. It's never static, or it's rarely static more than just a short time. And then it's changing again. And that opens up the potentiality for resisting or contesting the order. So, Åsa, can you just tell me how I'm doing on time? Because I can't see my clock. So how long did I speak?
As it's like it's almost 22, so about 5 minutes.
Yeah, perfect. So let me then just say a few things about this this case. So this is a microgrid. It's called the village is called Mawengi. So I'm gonna go a little bit fast here, but it's a hydropower plant in the southern highlands of Tanzania where people used to rely on kerosene and batteries and diesel generators, and then an international NGO together with the local church built a hydropower system that supplies a number of villages with electricity. And it has changed life in the village, provided access to a lot of resources, new services, and the possibility to use new appliances. And what I've looked at here is this particular project where this external actor comes, and then this sort of process or cycle of implementation. And I've seen that in this type of a project, you have these different stages where you come in with objectives and the strategy and the proposed system design that you then have to implement and translate into an actual system configuration on the ground. And we see a lot of things are changing when you move from that plan and the design to the actual configuration. But then once that infrastructure is in place, people have to gain access, and that's not a given. So people then have to gain access and maintain access to this new service. And then they are going to use it for a variety of things with particular outcomes, both at the individual level and at the collective level. And more aggregated over time and collectively, this then creates societal impact for the community. In this particular case, they started to electrify downstream villages and realized then that they had to electrify the upstream villages because the people there were the ones to protect the river long term from soil erosion, and they were really upset that they didn't get access to electricity. So these people were then started to lobby the organization and demand electricity also for them because they saw that they were excluded from this new technology, and it has a very profound importance in terms of a symbol of modernity and an improved life. So this small utility and the external NGO decided to then electrify, to change their plan, their configuration, extend it to meet the demands. And what I could see is that there's all these locations where these power relations are sort of being destabilized. So in the logic and the shaping of the process as such, these external actors were both aligning with the existing social order, but they were also trying to contest it. They were trying to empower women. They were trying to help poorer families. But at the same time, they had to align with those political interests and the local elites and their, in order to maintain that support. In the translation from plans to practice, a lot gets contested and reshaped. So this is a place where the entire idea and the social situation in the village also gets destabilized. And then once the configuration is in place, it tends to stabilize again over time. I could see changes to the existing distribution of resources, changes in division of labor, decision-making influence, but also dominant discourses and institutions. So these were all locations where some space opened up for contestation before it tended to close down again. Some people managed to gain access through collective and supportive actions. Otherwise, they would not be able. So their capacity to gain access was also depending on how, whether or not the implementers enabled that, supported that, but also what they themselves did. And the outcomes or the uses as such enhanced the productive powers of these people who could do more work in less time. And it kind of renegotiated the relationship between people's time, their labor, and resources, and it changed the understanding of value of those. So we could see a shift in discourses around both value and knowledge and expertise. Who is seen as knowledgeable? We could also see changing work organization and these changing patterns of mobility and the use of everyday space, and especially at nighttime where the light changed the use of the public spaces. And these things accumulated to shifts in identities and the meaning of spaces and material and social repositioning for some individuals, but also for the village as such, now being a place that is connected to the world. So the community was also seeing a change. If I zoom out to make this less specific and detailed, we can think about these as 4 locations. The first one being knowledges and ontologies, the second system and configurations, the third access and entitlements, and the last one everyday lives. And these then represent kind of methodological entry points, if you want to, where you can then start from either of those to then unpack what is going on. So the insight here is that power is emerging from these 4 locations in the sense that the relationships of power are reproduced and contested in a way that destabilize and reproduce social hierarchies. And we can't undo it, but we can trouble or transform a little over time. So we see this interplay and this uncertainty and ambiguity and the contradictions. But we also see a lot of new stability being created through the technological designs and the institutional frameworks that are set in place to govern this. So my question maybe to you is, and myself is power a useful concept? And I think it's important, and Amy Hallen and Dean kind of make this point, that we need to conceptualize power in a way that helps the sense making, and that depends on what you're studying. So we probably need a unique, tailored conceptualization adapted to your case or your phenomenon. So even if power is everywhere, the important question to me is, how do I distinguish exercises of power that are significant from in their effects from the rest, so to speak? And also, I always need to remember that what I do as an analyst and where I situate myself is not neutral or innocent, but actually my own process of framing these relationships of power does something. So I'm then sort of I'm part of a discourse and I may reproduce or disturb certain discourses or hierarchies through my own analysis. So here I need to think about how I conceptualize and what I draw on, where I give legitimacy to what, to whom. And so let me end there. And I have, of course, the resources for you for further reading, and I look forward to some questions.
Thank you very much, Helene. And thank you for a very useful presentation for us who are in the process of trying to understand power in sustainability transitions. And if you have questions, you can write them in the Q&A. And I don't see any questions right now, so I will start off with a question, which is more about your process in taking on to this understanding of power in sustainability transitions. It's almost to me like there is a power in defining power, because as you said, it's very overwhelming and difficult to to navigate. And how have you found any like resistance for you in your process of understanding? Is it difficult to get published, and when and how did you start to take on understanding and addressing the power issues?
It's a very good question. Because I think, especially as a young scholar, when I did this as a PhD student and then kind of consolidated my thinking after the PhD. And so I think when I came into my topic, I think for me, I kind of took for granted that I knew what power was. So like most of us do, we kind of assume that we know what it is. But I also felt that I have no idea how to study this with sharp analytical concepts. It wasn't readily available to me. So I kind of let go of it for a while. And then it was only after 5 years when I kind of finished all my case studies and I returned, I was writing up my thesis, then I realized now is the time, it's now or never. Now is the time when I can spend a couple of months just reading into this and thinking carefully about it. So I think, you need a time because it's such a huge topic. Then in terms of getting published, yes, there's some resistance. And I think that the primary thing that people do when you're trying, especially as a young scholar who doesn't have a name, to say something about power is that people kind of throw big names at you. So it's like, yes, but how about? And then it's like, you miss this person, you miss this philosopher, or how about Gramsci? How about Weber? And that's really overwhelming because, of course, you can't read all of them. You simply don't. No one has time for that, to read all of them. And so I think in the end, I had a very good review process with the journals because people were challenging me to be even more clear. But then in the end, also kind of rewarded me, saying that this is actually really good. But then the other thing that happens, and this has to do with me working in an African context, and so especially people who work outside of Europe and North America, our work tends to be disregarded a bit. So when I published a very conceptual paper using this case as an example, it was called by another colleague who's like the theorist, it was like mentioned as an empirical case when it's actually a conceptual case, right? And so I think that kind of dismissal, you need to be ready for that. But I mean, yeah, it's just one shouldn't care too much. There's always someone who will not appreciate and someone who will enjoy. So
yeah, thank you. Another question is, thank you very much for your talk. No, this is not from me, but from the audience. What are your thoughts on non-human intentionality in relation to power? Do you see a difference between non-human animals and ecosystems on the one hand, and inanimate objects like rocks or mechanical technologies on the other?
Yeah, this is a very good question. It's also a very big debate in the past 10 years. And of course, older because this goes back to active network theory and their insistence that all non-human objects, also rocks and tools, have agency. So I I disagree with a very, very broad or extended distinction of agency. I think it makes sense to maintain a connection to intentionality. Uh, but I mean, we're always surprised and we learn more again and again about animals and plants and how they are actually acting in the world and seemingly with intention. So I think we should hold that question open and definitely not be arrogant enough to say that this is only for humans. Analytically, though, we may want to maintain a distinction, but it depends on your case again. So I think there's no need for a super strong opinion. I think it's better to think about what is it analytically that I need to do in this situation to understand this. But what is important about artifacts and inanimate objects like rocks is of course that they can still be important in terms of producing effects or doing things. So if we use the idea of constitutive power, so we don't have to say that action theoretical power is not super important. It is, sure, but in terms of constitutive power, the materiality of things matter profoundly, and things can be very eventful and surprise us. And I think we all know that although the computer isn't alive and doesn't have an intention, it still obstructs us and our intention. So it's more about that relational view where, things emerge from my encounter with these things and these other living creatures. And therefore, it's what happens in that encounter that is important rather than me assigning agency to this or that.
Okay, thank you very much. And if anyone has a question, now is the time because we have a few minutes left. But yes, another question is no, yes. So a couple of more conceptual questions. How is power as embodied practice distinct from power as a resource? And could you elaborate on radical, conflictual, and repressive power?
Okay.
If you can do that in max 4 minutes.
Yeah, I'll do that. So embodied power versus power as a resource. So if I have a resource, let's say I have a title, a certain mandate, or I have money, I have material resources, right? They sit there and I have to do something with them in order to enact change in the world. So they provide resources. We draw on resources to exercise power, but they don't act in themselves. And even if I have a title, when I try to act based on that title, let's say the power given to me as a CEO, I may meet with resistance. So that thing, that title as a resource, is not in itself absolute or static. But when I draw on it to act, then what happens is I go into all these encounters with other people, with other organizations, and people react to my attempt to use my resource. So then what happens is that I can be I could lose the resource. It can be undermined. It can be contested. Maybe it's totally ineffective. So you don't, it's not the resource as such, it's how it's mobilized and how that encounter goes. That is important in my head. So rather than placing all my analytical focus on those resources and kind of doing a quantitative analysis of who has how many resources, like how much resources do we have? For me, what's interesting is the situations where you're using these along with other things, and there's always these other things, right? Especially you're mobilizing relationships, and those things tend to become much more complex quickly. And that is where, yes, it can be embodied, but it's like embedded and embodied into these situations. And that's why it's always changing. So it's dynamic. We should not think that resources aren't important. They are super important. It's just that if I only look at the distribution of resources, I'm not seeing the situations and the locations where power emerge and what happens in that.
Yes, the other part of the question, I think we'll have to save for our discussions with PhD students.
Let's do that.
Yes, so thank you very much, Helene, and thank you for your questions. And I just want to say that we have another, the next webinar in this series will be, we'll have to wait until the 11th of September, and that will be Anna Weinhus, who is assistant professor in environmental philosophy and ethics, and she will give a talk about multi-species justice and how that might relate to power in sustainability transitions. So thank you, everyone.